My nightmares began to worsen after Levi's departure. One particular dream recurred many times. Haunted by my horned shadow, I'd found myself walking through the deadwood, lost in the fog. There were countless eyes in the shadows, glowing, watching, staring, but none would help me. Despite desperate to find some light, any source of illumination, I ran deeper and deeper into the forest of dead trees, endlessly searching, endlessly panicking. Throughout this, the large shadowy demon continued to stalk me. I fervently ran away from him, only to end up staring into his glowing red eyes at the end of each and every path I'd take, and as my sanity spiraled out and away from me, he'd stand there, silently staring, tilting his head. After I'd always wake up in my bed in a cold sweat in the middle of the night, with unbearable pain in my wrists and ankles. They were bleeding, as if someone had driven spikes into them, leaving my entire bed covered in blood, yet the red would simply wash away from my unmarred flesh, revealing no wounds beneath it. I remembered from my studies that this was called stigmata. It was something else I would never tell a soul. It wasn't long before I was summoned to the convent once again. There, I found myself gazing into the tired, listless eyes of Magdalena. She wasn't strapped to the bed, and the room smelled fresh. Strangely, covering the walls were richly detailed fine and realistic portraits of different members of the congregation. Father Magnus told me that, a few days prior to our visit, she had come in on her own. Apparently, she hadn't even tried to explain to anyone her reasoning for being there. Even stranger, she showed no signs of demonic possession. Her brown skin hadn't paled, her caramel eyes were full of life and light, and she was buxom and voluptuous in her white nightgown. He asked me if he thought I could get her to communicate, since Levi told him that she and I were friends as children. Hoping for the best, I began to speak of the old times, our other friends, and Lucas. No matter what I tried, however, she ignored me. Nothing I had said seemed to interest her in the least. Perhaps she's wary of me, the exorcist offered. I will wait out in the hall for a while. Please continue, Joshua. Nodding, I watched him depart. As the door closed, I turned back to Magdalena, who was now sitting up in the bed and gazing out of the barred window. The blanket was clutched tightly to her chest. Mags, I began, stepping back toward her bed. I kept my voice soft and calm as best I could. Is this about Lucas? She slowly blinked behind those large round glasses. Her thick auburn curls were up in a messy bun. It was then that her eyes went from the window to her drawings on the walls. Following her gaze, I found one of all of us. It had me, her, Lucas, Levi, and Esther playing in the cemetery as kids. Tears filled my eyes as I suddenly remembered how happy I was to play with them, an emotion that had grown very scarce as I had aged. These are beautiful, I managed, trying to stop crying. My eyes then caught one of Levi. He was standing next to another teenager, one that I did not recognize, holding his hand. They were looking at one another, blushing, softly grinning, their lips parted mere inches apart, almost as if they were about to kiss, or they had just finished kissing. The second boy had vibrant blue eyes. Mags, I began, growing curious as the sound of pen on paper drifted over to my ears. Who is that? Turning around to face her, I saw that she was now drawing furiously. Her eyes were wide with madness and searing through her glasses as they focused on the paper below. I approached her and stood at her right, looking over her shoulder as she continued to draw. On the paper was an image of that horned shadow that had been haunting me so. Throughout my studies, Father Magnus had commissioned Magdalena to draw updated sketches of different demons and angels. The old ones were rather simple, with much less detailing, so hers were the images that we always referred to when studying the ancient scriptures and tomes on demonology. So obviously she knew what the devil looked like, but to draw him as a silhouette exactly as I'd been seeing him, and only when I had come to visit her? Mags, I managed, trembling, chills covering my entire body. Is that sketch for me? She grew still and dropped her pen onto the paper. Quietly, she tilted her head and looked up at me. A soft smile spread across her pretty face as she ripped the drawing from her notebook and handed it over to me. And in that moment, she parted her lips and took a breath as she opened her mouth as if she were about to speak for the very first time. Suddenly, she began to convulse. Foam formed on the corners of her mouth as she threw her head back onto the pillow behind her. This sent the sketchpad and pen flying across the room, and her entire body continued to violently shake. Mags, I shouted, reaching down for her, unsure of what to do. Father Magnus, help! As the exorcist charged in, Magdalena continued to seize. He immediately saw what was happening and ran to get help from one of the silent sisters. I could hear him roaring through the halls, desperately calling for anyone to come and help her. Crying and begging God to heal my friend, I helplessly watched her slowly succumb. Soon she was deathly still, staring at the wall of her drawings. I didn't have time to mourn her. That same red snake had appeared, slithering out from her left ear. It wagged its tongue at me as it slithered across her body, making its way toward me. On her right shoulder, it raised itself up once more. Gazing into my eyes, it began to speak in a strange, echoing whisper, "Taste of the fruit." As Magnus returned with a few of the Silent Sisters, the serpent slithered away and vanished from the darkness beneath the bed. They revived Magdalena, but she remained in their care. We were to visit her again later on. This was the first seizure she had experienced as far as her parents knew. They shared with me some information that I had never known about her, however. She was adopted. Long ago, when I was still a babe, the cries of a very young little girl were heard from the deadwood, and when a few deacons went to go investigate, they found little Mags, a toddler, covered in dirt and starving to death. They assumed that she had escaped from one of the mysterious cities the elders were always warning us about, but it was clear that she could not have survived in the depths of the deadwood alone. A parent or an older sibling had to have been with her, but no matter how long or fervently the deacons searched, they could not find a soul out there. Little Magdalena was given to a young couple with brown skin as to match her own. Her adopted parents were then sworn to secrecy. They thanked God for their little miracle, loved her as if she were their own, and never spoke of it again. That was until that day in the convent. That tremor she had experienced, it was demonic in nature, I was certain of it. The culprit had to have been the serpent, I thought, the demon that plagued me so. Somehow, when she was studying demonology and putting pen to paper to draw the creatures of darkness to life, the evil within them must have attached itself to her, and she was such a good and righteous girl she easily sensed it. That had to be the reason why she came to the convent of her own accord. After about a week, I was stopped once again by Headmistress Rebecca in the hallway of the school. The tall, intimidating woman immediately asked me if I had seen Levi. There was a strange look in her dark eyes, not one of concern, but one of pure malice. It chilled me to the core, so I lied to her. She told me to tell her if I were to see him again, and I told her I would, but I knew I wouldn't. God will tell me if you're lying. Bearing false witness is against one of the commandments, she said through a smirk. Raising a single brow, she tilted her head and studied me through her curved glasses. She then raised those glasses up and looked me up and down beneath them as if she were judging me. God tells me everything, you know. This struck me as strange. God actually speaks to you? I asked. You hear his voice? Not even Pastor Blackburn had ever claimed such a thing, saying that instead God showed him signs. Only the priests were said to be able to commune with Jesus Christ and God, which is why we had to confess to them our sins and ask what we should do as penance. She looked at me as if I were broken. Aw, sweetie, doesn't he communicate with you? Help you with decisions, extrapolate on certain scriptures, warn you of others' sins? She queried. The headmistress then laughed. It must be all this darkness around you. As she said darkness, she wagged an index finger all over, pointing it to me as she looked me up and down again. If I were you, I'd go confess to one of the priests. Perhaps they can help you atone before you're sent to the convent and you never see the light of day again. She then placed her glasses back over her dark eyes before making her departure. She was a thin, tall woman looking down on most men. Her dark, wavy hair trailed down her entirety, almost touching the floor. Always dressed in full-body black-sleeved and gloved dresses that covered every inch of her skin aside from her face, she always seemed to eerily float or glide everywhere she went. Like a ghost, she haunted the halls of that school, striking fear into the hearts of every single student, including her own son. After that, there was a hunt for him. Deacons were sent out into the fog every week to try and find him and bring him back. Once they did, there was no telling what was going to happen. No one I asked had any answers for me, as someone leaving the church was unprecedented. Though this brought about some stories of a woman who was actually excommunicated from the church quite a number of decades prior. Sarah was said to have been a young and beautiful silent sister, and was very skilled at healing the sick. It was said that this was because she was secretly a witch, and she was seen dancing naked with a horned devil in the dead wood around the fire at night. Inexplicably, her stomach began to grow round as if she were pregnant. And when the elder council received word of this, they held a midnight mass for her. There, she was stripped naked before the entirety of the clergy, and a witch's mark, a severe burn said to be from the fires of hell itself, was discovered covering the whole of her legs, leading up between them. The nightmare story did not end there, however. Sarah's naked, flayed corpse was found in the depths of the fog-smothered deadwood some 13 days later. A bloody and grisly sight. It seemed as though she had been eaten alive, as most of her internal organs were missing, and what little remained of them seemed to have been chewed on. The placenta had been mostly consumed as well, but the baby was nowhere to be seen. Everyone said that it was an army of demons that consumed her and took the child. They described them as completely white goats, moose, and deer with upside-down heads and black, empty eyes, all horned creatures that usually consumed plant life. This was believed to be because the devil only used her to bear his child. Once it was ready to be born, he took it and left her to die. Apparently, as soon as the deacons found her, they buried her in a shallow grave within the depths of the deadwood. They didn't bother with a funeral, as she had been excommunicated. Her soul was already lost. Showing any sort of respect in death would have just been a waste of time and energy. Everything I heard about this story was completely against my will. It seemed like absolutely everyone, even my own parents, were suddenly obsessed with it. Sarah and her demise were all anyone could talk about for what seemed like forever, and the more I learned about her terrible fate, the more I feared for Levi. Soon, this fear began to consume me. I desperately wanted to speak to Miss Mary, but she was on another one of her missions. It was then that I remembered Headmistress Rebecca's words. She told me to confess my sins to one of the confessional priests. Each confession was supposedly anonymous. For this reason, neither the priest nor the confessor could clearly see the other within the shrouded walls of the confessional. Both sides were separated by a mesh wall, and there wasn't any light within. There were 2 confessionals in the sanctuary. Other than during Pastor Blackburn's sermons and Mass, they were manned by 2 of the priests at all times. I'm not certain how many there were in total, but had learned that they took specific hourly shifts. One night, after a particularly egregious nightmare about Levi being eaten alive by those demonic creatures, I found myself walking to the church through the dark and the fog. I quietly made my way into the sanctuary and immediately headed toward the confessional on the right. Nervous, as I had not done this in quite a while, I stepped inside and closed the door behind me with a shaking hand. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," I managed, my voice trembling as I performed the sign of the cross over my chest, shoulders, and forehead. I believe it has been months since my last confession, and this one is to be very different than the others, so I'm a bit frightened right now. The priest was silent for a moment. "I understand," he finally calmly said, his voice deep and masculine. He didn't sound tired at all, despite how late it was at night. "May God, who has enlightened every heart, help you to know your sins and trust his mercy." These words did little to help me. I turned to him. All I could make out was a shadowy figure on the other side of the mesh wall. "I lied, Father," I confessed. "I lied to someone, and now I am terrified of the consequences it may bring." He nodded. "And why did you lie, my child?" he asked. "Was it to protect someone's feelings?" My brows furrowed. "Not exactly. It was more to protect someone's safety," I explained. My heart felt as if it were banging against my ribcage, desperate to escape. But because of that lie, that someone may be in even more danger. Again, the priest grew silent. It seemed as if he were thinking of a response. "Satan," he said suddenly, "is said to be both a liar and the father of lies. Do you believe that?" These words froze me in fear. "Satan?" I whispered. I was now staring down at the floor of the confessional, trembling in fright. Out of the corners of my eyes, I could see 2 red glowing orbs staring at me from the other side. I wasn't speaking to a priest at all, it seemed. "Satan, Beelzebub, Abaddon," he slowly bellowed. His voice was now splitting into an entire choir, it seemed, a dark one, singing the praises of the different forms of the devil. Iblis, Belial, Lucifer. Flames shot up all around him, vibrantly illuminating the entire area. I could feel the heat radiating toward me from the mesh wall between us. Gasping, I stood up and tore through the door of the confessional. Hearing that dark choir continue to sing the many different names of the devil behind me, I ran through the suddenly shadowy sanctuary, praying to Jesus to cast a shield of his light around me. As I approached the entrance, I heard the confessional's second door loudly creak open, and in his normal voice, the priest called out to me, saying that he did not yet assign my penance. He asked me to wait, sounding genuinely concerned for me, but I was so filled and fueled by fear that I had no choice but to ignore him. I ran all the way home and hid within the blankets of my bed. There I continued to pray for protection, panicking and hyperventilating. Eventually I cried myself to sleep, and I never went to confessional again. It wasn't long before I graduated. A few months passed, and I was just about to receive my title. Soon I was to be performing exorcisms all on my own. The thought of teaching a young acolyte and showing them the horrors I'd witnessed seemed awful, however. I wasn't certain how Father Magnus had managed it. He and I were sitting on the steps just outside of the church. The massive castle-like building loomed over us ominously as I gazed up into the ever-gray skies. We shared stories about our childhoods, and much to my surprise, his was filled with just as many nightmares and horrific, unexplained visions as mine had been. He told me of an inhuman creature he would see stalking the halls of the school at night, dragging a massive bloody sword behind it. Calling it the Inquisitor, he described it as a sort of living suit of armor, like that of a medieval knight, trailing a white, tattered cape behind. Apparently, it loudly clanked as the pieces of armor slammed against each other with every slow, calculated step it took. I could never figure out what was beneath its armor, but from its movements I knew it wasn't human, he explained, staring off into the fog. His hands were trembling as he fiddled with his fingers, and when he found a sinner, he would carve them up with such ease. Just blood and gore everywhere, a pile of wet, red viscera where a human had once stood. Swallowing nervously, he turned to me, but then it would be gone, its victim perfectly safe. My brows furrowed in confusion. This sounded strikingly similar to my own experiences with the demonic. Do you think it was all in your head? I asked. He shook his head and turned away. I feel that it was more so in my heart, my broken heart, he explained, touching his hand to his chest. It was somehow made up of the pieces of it, the shards of my sorrow, reflecting, in a way, my own actions as an exorcist. His green eyes widened as he realized what he was saying. Flashing a concerned glance back to me, he took a hold of my hand. Promise me you won't tell anyone my words here tonight. You know full well what would happen to me if the church knew of these visions. His fear surprised me. It seemed that even those of a higher rank weren't safe. This would render all of my hard work as moot with just one mistake. I had to be perfect in order to stay alive. I reached over with my other hand and held his within both of mine. I promise, I whispered through a feigned smile. You're safe with me, my friend. I didn't tell him of my own demons, despite desperately wanting to. My fear of the consequences proved too great. At the time, I felt as though I were keeping myself safe. Unfortunately, this was something I would come to regret. That night, my dreams were haunted by Father Magnus. Within them, we were together in a bright, white, featureless, formless area, perhaps made of light itself. He was smiling over at me, chuckling happily, but flashes of a pale, bloated corpse violently interjected the scene. Over time, his chuckles became shrieks of agony, tears streaming down his strained face as it slowly warped to that of the cadaver. I awoke from that nightmare to find my mother standing in the doorway of my bedroom. She told me that Exorcist Magnus had killed himself in the night. Pastor Blackburn found his body hanging from the chandelier in the sanctuary of the church. It was apparently a ghostly pale with a horrified expression forever frozen on his face. That was the day I was supposed to become a full-fledged exorcist. There was to be a ceremony within the sanctuary led by Magnus himself before all of the congregation. I was ignored, which is what I would have preferred, and instead preparations for Magnus's funeral were the priority. The body was still there. Perhaps maliciously, Pastor Blackburn had waited for the entire congregation to show up before cutting the rope with that cross-shaped blade. I couldn't bring myself to even look at what remained of my former teacher. It was then that I received a summons from the Elder Council, one for a midnight mass, which rarely occurred and usually meant something bad. It was mandatory for every member of the clergy, teachers, deacons, nuns, priests, and Pastor Blackburn to attend, yet no one else was allowed, especially not children. This would be the first one I had ever attended, and it was about me. In the dead of night, when the sanctuary was usually empty, I reluctantly arrived to meet the elders. They were comprised of 3 nameless priests that had all been within the church for nearly a century. The 3 of them offered me wine and bread before we began and quoted the scriptures about Jesus' blood and body. I downed the wine at once and remembered the horror stories I'd heard about these enigmatic figures. These were the men that sent people and children to the convent. And after the stories my classmates shared with me, Sarah's tragic tale as well as those of the possessed, I was horrified. But I was determined to stay and see what it was they wanted from me. The elders were so old they did not look unlike a group of walking corpses. Their voices were just as strained and rough as those of the afflicted in the convent. They were adorned with gold and jewels, dripping in sparkles and splendor, while the people of the village all but starved. Shrouded in black hooded, golden trimmed robes, they stood before the pulpit in a triangle formation, facing me as I stood in the middle of the aisle between the pews before them. I was incredibly relieved to realize that they were only testing me about the knowledge I'd collected over the years about exorcism and demonology. Poor Magnus had not updated them on my progress in a while, and so they wanted to see if I was indeed ready to take on such a role within the church. So I answered them as honestly as I possibly could, praying to God that they did not know of the demonic thorn in my side. Their questions began simple enough. I was quizzed on what sort of demons I'd encountered over the years and how they affected their unwilling hosts. Then when we got into scripture and the tools of exorcism, such as the trusted Bible, holy water, and crucifix, and which specific uses they had. After this, they wanted me to recite from memory a few of the different cases that Magnus had on file. However, about halfway into this strange interview, their questions became more vague and confusing. They began to ask me about what I'd learned about exorcism and demonic possession over the years, as if there were some grand secret to uncover. This led into inquiries about the church itself and how I felt about the possibility of holding power within it. I wasn't certain how to answer these questions and nervously asked for a bit more clarity on the subject. Instead, they told me that I was not ready to become a lead exorcist, nor had I learned enough to even be a full-fledged underling of one. Their voices were in unison, almost in an unnatural manner, and filled with disdain. It reminded me of how my father had always spoken to me, disappointed. The murmurs and mumbles of the clergy behind me were apparent. Though I could not hear them clearly, I knew they were all judging me. I wasn't good enough. I never was, and I never would be. As the council separated and began to depart, I stepped forward. But wait, does that mean I'm still just an acolyte? I watching them all go their separate ways. Tears filled my eyes once again as I thought of my teacher and the massive hole he'd left in the torn, frayed fabric of my life. Who would I be assisting now that Magnus is gone? They shot bitter glares back to me as the onlookers faded into the shadows of the black sanctuary. Acolyte, how could you possibly assist anyone? You are no longer allowed to even participate in such important rites, they growled, their voices still eerily unified as they loudly echoed throughout the church. Father Isaac will replace Magnus as lead exorcist, but that is none of your concern. You've had your entire life of 18 years to learn the subject, and you're still just as blind as and naive as a child. With such a bleeding heart, you could easily be led astray by the forces of darkness. Why, we wouldn't be surprised if you've been having dark communion with the devil himself. You are a disappointment to this church and your God. Be grateful we aren't excommunicating you for such sacrilege. Sacrilege? I'd done everything by the book, the good book. There were so many cases I'd helped with that, if it weren't for me, the victim would have died from starvation or dehydration. And now they were back in the pews every Sunday, listening to Pastor Blackburn's wrathful rants, remembering very little of the trauma they had endured. Why was that not good enough for the older council? Jesus himself had a bleeding heart for those in need. What was it that the possessed needed from me that the council felt I wasn't providing? What were the right answers to their odd questions? No matter how I searched my mind, I could not decipher this puzzle, this conundrum of right and wrong, good and evil. After everything I'd witnessed, it all seemed to be mixed and melted together. I collapsed into tears as they departed. A deep churning panic had arisen within me, and I was hyperventilating as I sobbed uncontrollably. Soon I was alone in the darkness, weeping before that massive statue of the crucifixion. Dear Lord, please, I sobbed, please forgive me. Begging for forgiveness, I realized that my father was right all along. I was destined to fail in my endeavors, and now it seemed as though I had wasted my entire life. My dreams were yet again haunted that night. Again, I ran away from my red-eyed shadow, but now I was also being stalked by those horned creatures with the upside-down heads from Sarah's tale. Pale, deformed, hairless moose, deer, and goats, chewing on the bloody organs from the fresh, open, naked corpses beneath them, awaited me at the end of every path I took. And soon it was my own flesh that they craved. They began to chase me, roaring and growling, unlike any animal I'd ever heard. Thick, discolored drool oozing down from between their bloody, elongated teeth. The goats were rather small, and the bucks were about my height, but the moose towered over me, and even their running as they chased after me was horrifyingly violent. They kicked up chunks of earth with ease beneath the mighty weight of their hooves. Tripping over roots and rocks, I struggled to get away, running deeper and deeper into the forest of dead trees, desperately praying to God for mercy, for forgiveness. In the chase, I found myself in a part of the lifeless forest that I did not recognize whatsoever. Hanging from nooses and From the dead tree's highest branches were shadowy, featureless cadavers. Hanging from each of their nooses like a necklace was a golden cross charm. Their only other similarity was the fact that they were all completely naked, but they ranged dramatically in skin color and age. Some were even children. This made me think that my only escape from these demonic creatures that hounded me so was if I took things into my own hands. The only scenario in which I wasn't eaten alive by demons was if I found a back door out of life, like these people, like Father Magnus. No matter which direction I ran, I would always see my horned shadow's glowing eyes in the darkness betwixt the dark dead trees. Soon I realized that he was actually trying to lead me away from them. Despite my reluctance, I began to follow him instead of running down random paths. He would vanish when I came upon him. A few seconds later, he would reappear in the distance, and I would run toward him again. It wasn't long before I came out of the deadwood and into a scorched clearing. The demonic creatures that had been following me seemed to vanish behind me as I did so, as if they simply weren't allowed to exist there. Was this some sort of holy ground? Within the center of the blackened meadow was a pentagram of flame. Within it, my horned shadow levitated in the air, seemingly sitting on nothing. He was completely naked, in a meditative position, with his legs crossed flatly before him. His right arm was up at his side, with his index finger and middle fingers pointed upward, while on the descending left arm the same fingers pointed downward. Despite the light of the fire below, he was still shrouded in shadows. At first I thought he was fully erect. As I slowly and cautiously approached, however, I saw that what I mistook as his penis was that large red snake rising out from between his crossed legs. With its back half wrapped around his waist like some sort of belt, it wagged its tongue at me in recognition. My horned shadow quietly stared at me through those glowing blood-red eyes. When he opened his mouth, I expected a roar. Instead, out flowed a soft, dulcet lullaby of backwards words. Even though I could not understand them, they still somehow comforted me, and that in itself is what terrified me the most. That was Chapter 3. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Look forward to Friday for Chapter 4, Born Again. This is my own writing, and I hope you guys enjoy it. I'm not going to record another thing today because it is freaking hot in here, and I have to upload 2 videos tonight. But I'm also doing horror gaming all month long, and I just made a video about creepypasta. But I love you guys, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!
We were dead a long time ago. We've been ghosts since days of old. We were dead a long time ago. We're the ghosts of the stories you've told. We were dead a long time ago. We've been ghosts since the days of old. We were dead a long time ago. Ghosts in the scary stories you've told. Shadows in the moonlight. Creatures in the trees. Glowing eyes surround me as I question all I've seen. The past has come to haunt me. From within my shallow grave, my memories